how much you eat, what you eat, and when do you eat. Which one is the most important? Which one is the least important?
I think a lot of people benefit from higher protein intakes. I think where the protein is coming from is really important.
Going to a podcast and getting coffee is bad without any context or whatever.
Unless it's my coffee.
Yeah, unless it's my coffee, of course. Okay, Greg, Siim, thanks for being here. So, because there might be a group of people that don't know who you are, I'd be curious if you guys could give me a bit of background on, I guess, your educational background, just a few minutes on that, and generally, yeah, I guess just generally who you are.
Yeah, Greg, you can start.
Thanks, Siim. Hello, everyone. I'm Greg. In terms of educational background, did my undergrad in sport and exercise science at Loughborough University. And around that time, I first started coaching people too. Worked primarily with 100 and 200 meter sprinters. And then also really deepened my interest in science. And I did a project that was sponsored by the Physiological Society that was looking at relationships between skeletal muscle fiber composition and sprinting and jumping performance. And then continued down that path, doing an exercise physiology master's at the same university, carried on coaching. But around that time, I realized that I wanted to broaden my understanding of the various factors that affect long-term health and performance. And so I was looking at PhD opportunities and found one at University of Leeds, which was basically about the intersection between how we sleep, our biological rhythms, how we eat, and our metabolic health. And about halfway through that, I started working with various different businesses. One in particular, I was the content director at a digital health platform called HumanOS. And since that time, having graduated in 2018, I've been involved in many different projects, but most relevant to today, co-founded a nutrition business in 2020, which was called Resilient Nutrition. I was the chief science officer there, and I was in charge of all the science education stuff and formulating the products. And nowadays, I'm the CSO of a North American supplement startup, which is trying to help people live longer through careful selection of nutraceuticals. And over the years, I've coached people across a big spectrum, everyone from high functioning athletes to people with complex chronic health conditions. And in terms of other projects, I do a little bit of public speaking. I work with a data science business, which is trying to build predictive models to forecast change in chronic disease risk based on variables such as blood data. And I also help out with various different science communication projects, which is largely on an ad hoc basis. And I help a business that runs retreats. So I'll pause there. But the common theme that runs through everything is how do you help people sustainably support their long-term health and performance through personalized interventions?
Yeah, that's great. I honestly, I didn't know some of that background about you, Greg. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I'm a Siim, and I have a background in anthropology, which I studied many years ago. And anthropology is just a study of humans in general. That it involves many different aspects. And after studying anthropology, I started to do like content online full time. And I've been doing YouTube for 8 years, or actually 9 years by now. So yeah, I'm a pretty long-term YouTube content creator. I've written multiple books, not on just nutrition, but also just health and fitness, and 9 books by now. So I've been researching nutrition for over 10 years at this point. I'm involved with a few companies as well that are gonna be launching later. But yeah, it's in the realm of health span and longevity optimization. So that's kind of the short story.
Only
Sweet.
9 books, you slacker.
Well, the 10th one is coming out later soon. Then I can say that I'm finished.
On average, how long does it take you to write a book?
Depends on the book.
Mm,
Let's say, my longest book, The Longevity Leap, which is the last one, took me 8 months. It's like 500 pages, but I was writing pretty much 8 hours a day
wow.
for 8, 9 months.
Yeah.
And, the other ones might take a bit, shorter, so maybe 4 months.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of work. Yeah, 10 books, 9 books. I don't know if I if I'd have that in me. That's pretty impressive. Okay, well, I guess the topic that we're going to be talking about today is nutrition. So we've done a few other podcasts. We've discussed the supplementation side of things, the exercise side of things, and today we're going to be discussing the nutrition aspect of things. So I'm going to run through what I think kind of some questions that I've been thinking about for quite some time. And I think some questions that hopefully will help the average person as well as the person that's trying to kind of extend to the extremes. Because you have, especially in the YouTube world, I know Siim knows this quite well, and Greg knows this too, that you're going to have groups of people that aren't looking for the average. They're also looking for how to push the limits. So we'll try to address both within the context of a single podcast. So let me start out with kind of a hypothetical question. So let's say you're in a social setting and someone finds out that you're a leading health expert. So you just gave them the exact spiel that we just gave. And then they ask you, well, what is the best diet? How would you respond? And I have a very particular answer for this, but I'm especially interested to hear how you guys would respond to that question. So, again, what is the best diet? Let's start with you, Greg.
Well, someone asked me that question, I'd say, I'm really sorry, I really need a pee. And then I'd just try and avoid them the rest of the evening.
Okay, great. Okay, you seem?
If if it was forced on me, then I would give them a predictably boring, nuanced answer. And I would say that it, of course, depends on lots of factors. A few of those, not all of them, include what the person's goals are. For example, someone who's trying to build muscle as quickly as possible is going to take a different strategy from someone who's trying to navigate some sort of chronic health condition. Another would be someone's current health status. If you have type 2 diabetes, then that might influence various aspects of your nutrition. Someone who is pregnant or breastfeeding has different nutrient needs, and also how they eat is going to influence various different metabolic and taste preference parameters in their offspring too. Then one would be ancestry, and this isn't something that we understand that well, but there's a little bit of evidence suggesting that someone's genetic background might be helpful in personalizing some aspects of their nutrition. There's research relating to things like how well people desaturate fatty acids and the number of copies of salivary alpha amylase they have, and therefore how they respond to carbohydrate intake and so on. Another would just be someone's taste preferences. I'm not going to force a diet on someone if the person hates the food that is present in the diet. Another would be someone's values. If, for example, someone is really interested in animal welfare and environment sustainability, then that might shape their food choices. Whereas if someone has just been following all the carnivores on YouTube, they might be a bit less fussed about that stuff. And then what has this person tried previously? If they haven't had success with a type of dietary strategy that I might otherwise have suggested, then that probably isn't going to make much sense for them. And then just panning back, I'd say in terms of the general dimensions of nutrition, and we can actually apply this across different lifestyle domains. I'd take a similar framework for sleep and physical activity too. I think there are a few dimensions that matter. So one of those would be the diet composition, and we can break that down in various ways, but it includes obviously things like the nutrition, so the macronutrition, carbohydrate, fat, protein, alcohol, and the micronutrition too. But there are also other factors in food that will influence various aspects of someone's biology. And those could include chemicals that are present in fungi, polyphenols in plants, zoochemicals in animal foods. The list goes on. Another dimension would just be timing. And that's something that's only really received attention in recent years. And we can frame that in different ways. Commonly, people speak about what is colloquially referred to as the eating window. So the time elapsed between when you first start consuming something that contains calories on a given day and when you finish your final calories for the day. I would call that the caloric period just because I'm a nerd. But within that, we can also look at the distribution of someone's energy intake. So you could have a fixed caloric period where in two conditions, someone's eating from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., an 8-hour window. But in one condition, much of the energy is front loaded within that window. And in another, it's loaded towards the end of the window. And then you could separately have an energy domain, but I put that in the composition bucket. And then finally, there's one kind of meta domain that applies to all of those, which is regularity. So, how consistent is someone's diet timing, and how consistent is their diet composition from day to day? And by this point, the person would have fallen asleep, and then they wouldn't want to speak to me. So, I still would have won.
That's an excellent answer, especially the last bit. Now, um, yeah, the way I think about it is actually very similar to what you were getting to, that there's so much nuance to it, that you'd have to dig in deeper. So I would say that, I mean, I had a much shorter answer at like a dinner party or social setting. I would just say that that's impossible to answer in this short conversation that we're going to have here, simply because of all the reasons that you laid out. Looking at timing, looking at the circumstance, looking at the time of day. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that you can take into consideration. I don't know. What about you, Siim? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's super complex and super context dependent to the individual. I mean, the main framework and the principles are going to be very similar, but there's always going to be these small nuances in macros and types of foods they eat and meal frequency, etc., that depend on the individual. But I would like to maybe, let's say, frame it the way I was on Matt Caberlin's podcast a few months ago, who is one of the more renowned longevity researchers, and he asked me like, okay, if you were to rank how much you eat, what you eat, and when do you eat, in importance, which one is the most important, which one is the least important, then I said what you eat and how much you eat, they're very equally important. But at the end of the day, it still matters how much you eat. And that is still the most important thing, because that determines whether you're gaining weight or losing weight, and whether or not you're going to become obese or stay at a leaner body composition. And if we understand anything about health, then it is that obesity is bad, that being obese cuts down on your life expectancy and increases the risk of pretty much all other chronic diseases. So the number one goal of the diet would be to avoid obesity and excess adiposity. Now, how much body fat do you need? That depends on your biological sex. Like, are you male or female? There's research that for females, it matters a lot less how much body fat they have, as long as they're not super obese. For males, it appears that you need to be slightly more leaner for health benefits. But yeah, how much you eat determines your adiposity, regardless of what you eat, so to say. So if you're eating a very healthy diet, whatever you think that is, you're eating only whole foods, or you're eating only meat, or you're eating only plant foods. If you eat too much, then you're gonna be gaining weight, and that's gonna eventually harm your overall health. It's gonna eventually result in excess visceral fat, excess adiposity, worse metabolic health, worse inflammation, etc. So the number one thing is at the top would be how much you eat, maintaining a semi-calorie balance, and just adjusting your calorie intake based on your body fat percentages. That's how I just like to roll. that, okay, I see that you're gaining too much body fat, reduce your food intake or increase your energy expenditure or something like that. If you see that you're becoming too skinny or too frail, you want to build muscle, then you just need to increase the calorie intake or increase carbohydrate or protein intake, whatever the case may be. The second thing is, what you eat, and generally, it doesn't have to be something that is perfect. There's a lot of thought that you need to be on this 100% Puritan diet, that nothing is processed and that everything is 100% grass-fed or organic whole food. I don't think that's the case. If your diet is 80% whole food, then that 20% of whatever processed foods isn't going to undermine the other components of your diet. And as long as you're in a calorie balance, it's not going to undermine your health as well. Now, there are some little nuances there. If you're lean, but you drink too much alcohol, which does contain calories, then you might gain too much visceral fat, or you might have a little bit of fatty liver, or too high triglycerides, whatever it is. So your blood work can still be suboptimal, even at a lean body composition, if you drink too much alcohol, for example. And that can apply to some other processed foods as well. You might be otherwise healthy and lean, but you consume too much sugar and you have pre-diabetic blood sugar levels or something like that. So there is, still a principle of eating predominantly whole foods that I think should be followed, but it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. If it's 20% processed foods, 80% whole foods, I think that for most people is possible. But generally, let's say 90% whole foods, 10% some processed foods is going to be realistic for the average person, because it's just more easier to adopt in the modern world where there is a lot of processed foods. You're not going to be always able to eat your grass-fed steak with organic vegetables, so needs to be some flexibility as well. And as long as you're not, I guess, mentally afraid or very stubborn about your diet, then you can pull off with, let's say a 10% suboptimal diet, because it's not going to undermine the rest of your diet. And the last component is when you eat. I'm a huge fan of intermittent fasting. I'm a huge fan of circadian rhythms and time restricted eating. And I do think that it has an important role in health, but I would still put it at the bottom of the totem pole, that it's important, but it's not the most important thing. Calories matter the most. What you eat comes then. And the last part is when you eat. So the general framework here would be that don't eat in the middle of the night, at the biological nighttime for humans, that you want to consume most of your calories or all of your calories during the biological daytime. You don't need to do some sort of intermittent fasting, but let's say within 1 hour of waking until few hours before bed should be the eating window for most people. Now, of course, some people can't follow that they're doing shift work or they have some jet lag or something like that. Then there are ways to go around it, but generally you should try to eat in a way that makes you consume 99% of your calories during the biological daytime. I want to take a quick break to let you know about my favorite wellness devices, which are the Bond Charge red light therapy devices. You've probably seen many of your favorite longevity influencers using these red light therapy devices, but do they actually work? Yes, they do. Red light therapy has been shown to have many benefits on skin anti-aging, hormone optimization, pain management, and even exercise performance. I use my device every day for 15 minutes, especially during the winter months when there's not much sunlight. It increases my energy in the morning and makes my skin glow. Just check out the testimonials on the Bond Charge website for the before and after pictures of other people. Most red light therapy devices don't have the right wavelengths of light, which might mean you're not getting the claimed benefits. Bond Charge uses the exact wavelengths of light used in research, and they also have near-infrared light that's beneficial to the joints. Head over to bondcharge.com and use the code SIIM, SIIM, for a 15% discount.
That is an incredibly good answer. I love the rank order of how you think about that. Because I think in a short conversation I would have with someone, if I was forced into giving an answer, that would be exactly how I'd think about it too. Looking at the amount of consumption, then what's involved in that consumption, what are the nutrients, and then from there, looking at timing. And on the timing front, if I can just dig into that just a little bit more before we go on to the other questions, because this is something that I've thought about a good amount in relation to intermittent fasting. I think you guys would have a really great perspective on this that may be something I've never considered. I don't know if you guys have run across the literature showing that intermittent fasting tends to be this is the way it's put out there. It's not necessarily my opinion or the way I think about it, but that intermittent fasting is more beneficial if a person consumes their food earlier in the day compared to later in the day. Have you guys run across that literature or just run across that idea?
Well, Craig is the Mr. Time Sheet Eating, so I'm
Yeah,
sure he
Nick,
knows.
Nick, if you wanted to, you could find hours and hours and hours of podcasts of me boring people to tears about that subject. So
Okay.
yeah, I've come
Well,
across it.
okay. Okay, good. So, that's great. Could could you quote unquote bore us with your take
Yeah.
now? Because I would be genuinely really interested in that.
Well, I'll give you a hot take, but I'll first just return to something that Siim first raised, and that is just that we need to bear in mind that these different dimensions speak to each other, and these different pyramids have been around for a while, where people try to rank the relative importance of different things, and Eric Helms published one of those
Mm,
probably about a decade ago now, which largely aligns with what you guys were saying. But I think what is sometimes missed in that conversation, and I agree for the most part with what he said and what you guys were saying there, is that these different dimensions do speak to each other. And actually, if you speak about focusing on energy intake, then that can cause people to start thinking, well, okay, I will just start trying to count calories then so that I hit my energy intake target. And then within that, I can eat what I want. And that's typical of a type of IIFYM if it fits your macros approach. And that can work well for some people, but some people really struggle with that type of approach too. And so I just emphasize that sometimes if you focus on timing and macronutrition or specific food choices, then energy intake comes along for the ride. And you see that with time restricted eating across different studies on average. If people use time restricted eating, which, depending on how we define it, is confining all your daily calorie intake to a period of 12 hours or less each day. Whereas in my mind, intermittent fasting is something different. It's occasional use of a fast of 24 hours or longer, but that's not the way that most people use that term. But if people use time restricted eating, they'll slightly reduce their food intake. And then similarly, if people are focusing on, say, consuming more dietary protein or more dietary fiber, then they would tend to reduce their total energy intake too, relative to how they were eating previously. So just something to bear in mind. In terms of time restricted eating and early versus late time restricted eating, I do think that there are some small benefits to be had from front loading intake for many people, but the effects are modest. The early work on this that was compelling was done by Courtney Peterson, and she published some work on this in one of the Cell journals in 2018. It was done in adult men with prediabetes, and she had these guys restrict their food intake such that they were finishing their daily food intake by 3 p.m. And within a relatively short period of time, they had a dramatic change in their blood pressure. It was about a 10 millimeter of mercury drop in blood pressure, which is equivalent to what you get from a lot of hypotensive drugs. And they also had some improvements in insulin sensitivity and some markers of inflammation. And importantly, in that particular study, they tried to control the diet such that they didn't change their total energy intake. So those effects were independent of any change in energy intake. And there probably was a small effect on energy intake, but it was very modest and it certainly didn't explain those results. And most people see eating. To me, that study highlights a theme that's come up a few times in that type of research, which is that the people who stand to benefit most from this type of approach are probably people who are relatively sedentary, who don't have great metabolic health. And so, for the three of us sat here, do I think that early time restricted eating would yield any sort of meaningful benefit in our health parameters? No, I don't think it would. because it interacts with your physical activity and your general health and a variety of other factors too. The rationale behind front loading intake in that way is based on circadian biology by and large. If you look, for example, at oral glucose tolerance, then going by work by people like Frank Shear, it varies quite a lot over the course of the circadian day. And for the most part, it's higher in the biological morning than it is in the biological evening. And the thermic effect of feeding, so the amount of energy that it takes you to digest and metabolize food, tends to be higher in the biological morning too. So you'll burn a little bit more energy, everything else controlled for. There are fluctuations like that across the course of the day that suggest that front loading intake is going to make some sense. There are some other facts at play too, like there's the second meal effect, the idea being that a previous meal that you've had shortly before your present meal will slightly reduce responses in blood sugar to that second meal. So actually, in terms of distribution of energy intake and carbohydrate in particular, I'd argue that the meal where you want to concentrate most of those calories and carbohydrates is probably the second meal of the day, lunch. So having a big lunch works well for a lot of people. However, coming back to physical activity, if, for example, someone was working out after they finish the working day, they get to the gym at 6 p.m. and they've tried this type of early time restricted eating approach, and then they either skip dinner or they have a tiny dinner after they just depleted loads of muscle glycogen and induced lots of muscle damage, and their metabolic health is otherwise good. I don't think that that makes any sense. So you have to take it on a person by person basis. One thing to bear in mind comes back to what I began this boring answer with, which is that we eat different things at different times of day too. And so one of the effects of early time restricted eating might be some modest changes in people's food choices. This hasn't been very clearly shown by the research. I suspect that we would find this given adequate power and appropriate food recall methods. But take the example of alcohol. Not that many people are mainlining beer at breakfast. And so if you're using early time restricted eating and you're having a freakishly early dinner and you're finishing your dinner by 4 p.m. and previously you were having a glass of wine on the sofa at 7:30 p.m., you're probably going to end up drinking less alcohol, just as one example. So I think it is going to affect dietary choices too, and possibly therefore the quality of someone's diet. But just to reiterate, that hasn't been that well demonstrated yet. That's just one study that I mentioned. There are other studies that we could go into, but I like that because it was very rigorously done. There are 2 or 3 other rigorous studies. There are a bunch of null findings too in the literature. There's not really ever been strong evidence that late time restricted eating, where, for example, someone was beginning their first calorie consumption at 1 p.m. and finishing at 9 p.m., is superior to early time restricted eating. One more thing to bear in mind is that this is going to interact with how you distribute the calories and the macronutrients within the eating window too. So take 2 hypothetical examples. One of them is early time restricted eating, and your eating window is from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. But your 9 a.m. dietary event contains 100 calories. And then you have a small snack at midday, and then your final meal contains 3,000 calories. So it's backloaded within the early window. So the center of mass of your food intake is actually right around 3 p.m. You could also have late time restricted eating where your window starts at 1 p.m., finishes at 10 p.m., but you have all your calories at 1 p.m. and then the rest of the day you eat like a bird and you have a total of 200 calories. Center of mass there is earlier than it is in the early time restricted eating condition. So as always, there are nuances to this stuff. If you can make early time restricted eating work, your metabolic health isn't great, you're relatively physically inactive, then I think it's a good strategy for a lot of people. Otherwise, if you want to get some of the benefits of early time restricted eating, then I'd probably focus more on the distribution of your calories. And so you can have a longer eating window, but the idea is just that your first couple of meals are probably going to concentrate a lot of your food intake.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a lot of context. The I've always been a bit critical. Maybe I haven't looked at all the literature on this topic, but I've been a bit critical of some of the comparisons between the late time restricted versus early time restricted, in that I've always wondered if some of the measurements that researchers do, especially in the fasted state the next day, isn't biased by the fact of exactly that last point that you pointed out, that potentially a person's just backloading a lot of their calories, a lot of their food consumption much later in the day. And if you were to even compare that against a control group that is designed to space out their meals across 3 meals throughout the entire day, then the amount of food that they're consuming at the very end of the day is vastly different from what the group that restricts their consumption to later in the day would be consuming. So doing fasted measurements of like glucose and insulin and using measures like HOMA-IR, I think could be misleading in terms of how we're interpreting a lot of the benefits that come from some of this time restricted eating, or some of the the advantages that we give to, I suppose we'll say, I guess, the intermittent fasting period being later in the day as opposed to earlier in the day. So this study that you described, I'm not sure if I read it. Maybe I didn't. It's been a while since I've looked at that literature, but I'd be curious. So what you're saying is that there are other independent, more sensitive metrics that are not dependent on the timing, or not dependent on this loading of food at the end of the day versus earlier in the day. We still are able to distinguish that there are maybe some slight benefits with eating food earlier in the day compared to later in the day?
Yeah, just to reiterate, I'm just saying that for people with poor metabolic health in general, having an earlier eating window, controlling for everything else, tends to lead to slightly greater improvements in metabolic health parameters than putting it later in the day. I just want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned there too. So one is that if you look at some of the null studies, and probably the highest profile of these was in the New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago, they've probably not found anything because the contrast between the groups hasn't been big enough. So some of these studies that have said, well, time restricted eating doesn't lead to weight loss or metabolic health improvements. When you look at the eating windows between groups, the people in the control group, their eating window is 12 or 13 hours, and the people in the experimental group, their eating window is 10 hours. And so the difference between groups just really small. And so to actually see these types of benefits, there needs to be a substantial change between the groups. And that explains some of those null findings, not all of them necessarily. And then you mentioned HOMA-IR, so homeostasis model assessment of insulin resistance. Something to bear in mind with these types of studies is that the food that you consume is a time cue, a Zeitgeber that sets many of the clocks in your circadian system, the peripheral clocks that influence all sorts of local processes and tissues such as skeletal muscle, the liver, the gut, and so on. And those clocks basically function to schedule a timetable of events each day, when to build things, when to break things out, when to break things down, and so on. And so, given that, these studies that manipulate food timing are going to shift some of those clocks too, potentially. On top of that, when some sort of test is done at the end of an intervention, so let's say that it's a glucose tolerance test, the period of time that's elapsed between the final meal on the previous day and the test isn't necessarily standardized, which is something that's worth bearing in mind. And so you've potentially got a shift in the timing of those peripheral clocks, and you might have a much longer fasting interval from the final meal on the previous day to the test. And so there's some noise that's often not accounted for. I don't want to get bogged down in the experimental weeds, but I just want to highlight that there are nuances to this stuff, and it's actually quite hard, I think, for a lot of people to work out where the weeds are because they don't have a relevant scientific background and they might not be that familiar with the literature or have thought very deeply about those subjects.
It's that last point that is the one that I get hung up on. 'Cause that's the one where I question some of the validity of some of the results that have come out from some of the intermittent fasting literature. Exactly that the timing between tests, so the ending meal being completely calorie laden versus a meal that's much less calorie laden, but the calories across the day are still equated, and then the next day you do a fasting measurement of blood sugar, insulin, and then you do some of these proxy measures, and then you try to come to a conclusion with that. To me, it seems like there's a good opportunity there for us. You use the word noise to get a lot of noise in those measurements that we're not really accounting for. So I don't know. Anyway, it was great to get your perspective. Seem, how do you feel about the whole late intermittent fasting versus early intermittent fasting, considering your extensive experience with it?
Yeah, I've done different versions of that myself. In a few years ago, I had 8 p.m. dinner or something like that, and my first one at 1 p.m. Now I'm doing an earlier variation. I have my dinner at like 4 or 5 p.m. and first one is 10 a.m. So I do think that from my own experience, an earlier time restricted eating window is better for sleep. At least subjectively, I sleep better. My sleep scores are a bit better, and maybe digestion a bit better as well. So that's my own subjective experience from that. But I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to the totem pole that you can't say that someone who is even in a calorie deficit and eating a healthy diet, but they're having their eating window quite late in the day, that they're somehow unhealthier or that they're in a worse health condition compared to someone who is overeating calories but doing it early in the day. Right. So the hierarchy of these three factors matters still at the end of the day. And unfortunately, a lot of the studies yet, I feel, haven't completely controlled for all of these factors and variables that that the calorie content, I think, is a huge important aspect here. But the problem here is that most people who are doing late time restricted eating, they tend to follow the pattern that they are backloading pretty much all their calories later in the day as a diet adherence tool. So the reason they skip food in the early part of the day is that they can have a large dinner and not gain weight, because it's like a diet adherence tool. It's for some people it's easier to say no to all foods for the entire day and then eat whatever. uh, that's one strategy that people like to do. Some people have a different, let's say, preference, but I guess that's why most people do late time restricted eating as a diet adherence tool, that they have a lot of calories to eat in the dinner without gaining weight, so they can eat whatever they want pretty much. And it's hard to, yeah, there hasn't been like the perfect study to actually, I guess, address that component. From a physiological perspective, I do think that having a bit earlier eating window is probably better from like a circadian rhythm perspective, because if you eat a massive dinner at 10 p.m. and you go to bed at 11 p.m., let's say, for example, then I do feel that it might shift your circadian rhythm slightly later, because exercise does do that. If you exercise earlier in the day, you shift your circadian rhythm earlier. If you exercise later in the day, you shift it later. Um, so, and food is a huge regulator of the circadian clocks as well. So I think that there should at least a few hours before bed where you stop eating. Now you don't have to like have breakfast or anything. You can still skip breakfast and have lunch and dinner, but in my opinion, it might be better to just not have a dinner immediately before bed.
Can I just chime in with a few quick thoughts, Nick? I don't want to get too hung up on this stuff because I realize that there are many other things that we want to get to. But one of the things that I was just thinking about is that having a big dinner is culturally normal in much of Western Europe and North America. And so we have to think about how dietary patterns and food timing interface with norms and with people's lives too. So what Siim was saying there, I think a lot of that is just the function of the environments in which we grew up in. And if people are otherwise doing things very well and they end up having the largest proportion of their daily food intake in terms of their meals at their final meal of the day, then it's not a big deal. Another key point is that the size of the eating window does seem to somewhat relate to energy intake. So the smaller the window, the smaller the food intake tends to be. And this raises an important point, which is that time restricted eating isn't for everyone. This is not something that I would recommend to someone who's got a history of disordered eating or eating disorders, for example. Someone who's overly restricted their food in some way previously. It's also something that's probably not conducive to achieving an appropriate energy balance in some contexts. So, if someone had chronic low energy availability, they had relative energy deficiency, could be in sport, could be another context, and they were trying to get pregnant, saying that they should have an 8 hour eating window, I think is probably silly for the most part. And then what Siim was saying about the size of the final meal, this hasn't been studied to my knowledge, even though it's something that I think a lot of people have thought about for years. But I wonder if that interacts with energy availability. So, take an extreme example: you've got someone who's preparing for a bodybuilding contest, and deep into their prep, they're ravenous most of the time. And if they go to bed really, really hungry, they're going to struggle to sleep. Well, in that context, might it make sense for them to consume the biggest share of their daily food intake at dinner? I think it might do. So we just need to bear in mind that type of person specificity. Anyway, I'll pipe down now.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we've definitely gone down the intermittent fasting rabbit hole, but I think it's important. I think a lot of people use it, and a lot of people are considering using it. So it's an area of nutrition that should be discussed. It's funny that we started out by discussing calories, at least Siim and I, and Greg, I think for the most part also, and we discussed, the amount of intake is the most important, then the nutrients that you consume, and then the timing, and then we ended up going down a rabbit hole on timing specifically. It's pretty apt. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So, if we were to get more specific, let's say now you had all the time in the world, and I'm breaking this up into three separate goals that a person might have. One of them is one person wants to be in the top 1% of longevity. Another person wants to be in the top 1% of athletics. And then, of course, you could probably break that up into the types of athletics as well. And then one person just wants to have general well-being, just wants to be generally healthy, live a pretty long life, but isn't necessarily concerned with every morsel of food that they consume. How would they differ in terms of your approach to giving advice or just general recommendations that you would give those three individuals? Do you want to start it off, Siim?
Mm, yeah. Well, for athleticism, it depends a lot on the sports. For a sumo wrestler, the diet is different than for a gymnast,
Mm,
and a sumo wrestler, there's research that they have substantially shorter life expectancy than the average Japanese person. So yeah, let's say not sumo wrestling, but I don't know, track and field, because it's kind of similar to a general healthy lifestyle. So they're more similar across the groups. I would say that for an athlete, biggest difference from a general diet is that they just end up eating more carbohydrates and end up eating more calories overall. Now, an athlete typically needs to maintain a lower body fat percentage for a better body weight, like a force ratio. So a track and field athlete is, pretty lean, so they aren't eating a ton of calories, but they're probably eating more calories than an average person who doesn't exercise, just because they exercise a lot more. So the biggest differences between the person would be they eat more carbohydrates, they maybe eat more protein because they have more lean muscle tissue, and they eat more calories to fuel their workouts. And for an athlete, the meal frequency, I imagine, is also more relevant than to a general person. An athlete, depends on the sport specifically, but if they want to, let's say, maximize muscle anabolism and recovery, then they probably have to end up eating more frequently, especially protein. So they might have 4 protein meals a day, spreading out their protein. Whereas for an average person, spreading out the protein is a bit less important. So they can have, let's say, 2, 3 meals, whereas an athlete might have 4, 5, 6 meals, depending on their particular situation. And I don't think an average person needs to be on some low carb diet or restrict all carbohydrates, but they probably just end up eating less carbohydrates because they're burning less glycogen as well, and they're a bit less insulin sensitive. And an athlete probably is able to consume a lot more simple sugars. So they might have a Gatorade or some sugar gel during their workout to replenish their glycogen faster, whereas an average person never needs to do that. They don't need to have Skittles during their 30-minute Pilates class or something like that. And for general health and longevity, it depends also, like what you like to eat. If you want to maximize well-being and enjoyment in life, then you also need to consider the enjoyment of eating. When you eat, with who you eat, whether or not you consume alcohol or not, and what kind of food you eat. Having pizza with family over a glass of wine or something like that it could be considered like a wellness not an intervention, but a event, because you're getting some mental health benefits or relaxation. You're just enjoying yourself. Whereas for an athlete, it's probably out of the question because they need to focus on their sports, especially in like competitive season. And it's quite interesting in the top 1% longevity space. Some people would argue that, okay, never no alcohol, never pizza, never no kind of a junk food. But I would argue that it's also important in the longevity area because of the socialization and the mental health benefits. It's very underrated in like the online longevity discussion. Just the mental health benefits of socializing and letting it go every once in a while. Now, of course, if you're developing fatty liver and becoming diabetic from eating too much processed food or alcohol, then yeah, it's counterproductive. But an otherwise healthy person, they can have a glass of wine, let's say once a week. They can have a slice of pizza once a week, and it shouldn't have any detrimental effects on their blood work or long-term health if they're otherwise healthy. Now, it depends on, there's a spectrum of people with their health, but let's say a top 1% health individual, they can get away with it, and they don't have to necessarily manically obsess over that.
So you essentially don't have to be Brian Johnson to get into that top 1% then.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that totally makes sense. What about you, Greg? How do you think about it?
Quite similarly, for the most part, I would say comparing those three scenarios, the longevity diet is generally going to be the most strict, and it might focus on a few things. So it might focus in particular on diet quality, so the density of micronutrients and other health promoting substances in food, whatever those might be. It might also start to look to some of the different processes that seem to be driving aging and how nutrition intersects with those. I think nutrition is relevant to some of those. So things like autophagy, just to name one example. And then it would probably also focus more on quantification of health parameters and then trying to use nutrition changes to nudge things into ranges that we think are more optimal. So if, for example, someone's ApoB and their non-HDL cholesterol are running a bit high, then that might indicate certain dietary changes. If someone's triglycerides are a bit high, if they're a bit insulin resistant, all those types of things. The general well-being approach is going to be a bit like a more flexible version of that. And it would be about sustaining health and performance, but also with plenty of focus on enjoyment. And so I think in this type of instance, it's helpful to understand something about how to keep things in check when you do flex a bit. And I mentioned IIFYM earlier. I think that one thing that people can take from that, irrespective of who they are, is that when you do veer off your plan, if you have a plan, then you're just trying to keep your total food intake in check and maybe have some strategies to support that, because it's quite easy for the wheels to come off entirely during certain events, Christmas, Thanksgiving, that type of thing. And so at those times, I would just focus on trying to be quite close to your calorie targets and possibly your protein and fiber targets too, if I was to focus on certain things. And then when it comes to athletes, completely agree with what Siim was saying about total energy intake and carbohydrate intake, and also the importance of the specific athletic discipline or sport that someone is competing in. But when you put that to the side, the only other things that I'd probably mention would be that it can be helpful to have a more targeted approach. So the same way that we speak about periodization with training, there's been a lot of discussion about nutritional periodization in the last decade or so. So trying to manipulate, in particular, macronutrients in accordance with training sessions to facilitate certain outcomes. So doing some training sessions in a state of low carbohydrate availability, for example, to promote biochemical changes that support fat oxidation, just as one instance. And then there are probably some small differences between athletes and non-athletes, in addition to their energy needs and maybe the optimal carbohydrate intake in their micronutrient needs. So if you take the example of someone who's sweating a lot and is undergoing loads of muscle contractions, many more than someone who's more sedentary, then they're probably going to need slightly higher levels of certain micronutrients. But I think Seam otherwise nailed it, and those would be the only things that I'd add to that. How about you, Nick? I should say Nick the Impaler, sorry.
For anybody who's completely confused, that is a pre-podcast discussion. It has to do going back to my murderous tendencies. Anyway, moving on. Okay, no, I think I almost completely agree. I can't think of anything. I mean, obviously, if we were to have an entire podcast about how to be a top 1% longevity individual, there's plenty of nuances that we could get into. But in general, how do we separate the three? I agree with how you guys think about it. However, for the vast majority of people who are not necessarily trying to get into that top 1% of either, they're not trying to be the top 1% in their rec league, where they're absolutely destroying everybody around them, and they're also not necessarily trying to maximize their lifespan at the expense of certain enjoyments. Um, how do you guys think about some of the basics? So if a person comes to you and they're like, okay, here's my goal. I just want to live a long, healthy life. I want to be relatively happy with my food choices. I don't mind making a small adjustments here and there. And you had to rank order the emphasis of how a person should think about things. So let's go with like calories, protein, fat, carbohydrates, micronutrients, things of that nature. Is there how do you go about advising a person that just wants to live a generally healthy life? And then after that, I'm going to dive into that a little bit more, add some more context.
Yeah. Well, I would start with figuring out how much of, let's say, what would be their target goals for their body weight to eat. And this doesn't have to involve, tracking and measuring foods and tracking macros. It would initially just involve, okay, let's figure out what is your optimal body weight. If someone is, let's say, 10 kilos overweight, we need to figure out what would be their ideal body weight for longevity. And that's generally pretty easy to figure out. We know, like, okay, certain waist circumference is more optimal, and hip to waist to hip ratio, body fat percentage, those kind of things. So let's try to get you to an ideal body weight, whatever that may be. And the most important thing, like I mentioned earlier, for that is the amount of food you eat. So doesn't matter what you eat. If you're gaining weight, then you need to eat less, or you need to change some other variable that would prevent you from gaining weight and help you to reach the ideal body weight. And usually it just means cutting out certain foods or reducing certain foods. And the easiest things to cut out are carbohydrates and fats, because you usually don't want to cut out on protein, because most people are eating less protein than would be optimal. And carbohydrates aren't inherently essential, and fat is essential, but you don't need like a ton of fat. There's a threshold of fat you need. So if you want to lose weight, then reducing some of the fat and carbohydrate intake will help you to achieve that. And people oftentimes don't know how much carbs and fats certain foods have. So here they could go through like a short period of time of measuring things and quantifying things, just to educate themselves about the macronutrient composition of different foods. I've done it a few times in my life, and by doing that, you just develop this, third skill, or this spidey sense about foods, that you don't need to weigh the food, but because okay, whatever, chicken breast or steak, I approximately know how many calories it has because of a past reference, and you don't have to weigh it again. But just having the skill is something that most people lack. They never weigh the food. They think that, some people even don't know that, I don't know, that bread is a high carb food. Or I think, most people know that, but you can imagine that the average person has no idea how much calories a piece of steak has. But developing that skill is very useful, especially for people who want to, achieve very lean body composition, and to just improve their health or become aware of what they're eating. For protein, so yeah, just eat as much you need to maintain the optimal body composition. If you need to lose weight, then you need to eat less. If you need to gain weight, you're too underweight, then you just, you can eat more food. The next component would be protein. The research about the optimal amount of protein is, I think, pretty solid, or pretty consistent, that it's around 1.6 grams per kilogram per day of body weight. So that's around 0.74 grams per pound. So it's a lot less than some bodybuilders recommend, which is the 1 gram per pound. I think that's more than enough. And for maximal muscle hypertrophy, the intake of 1.6 grams per kilogram appears to be enough. Now, some people respond better if they eat more, but for the average person, I think that's already more than enough for just general health. If they eat less, then that's also fine, but they don't need to eat more protein, and then the rest of the calories can come from carbs or fats, depending on their insulin sensitivity, depending on their exercise demand, depending on the preference. If they don't like to eat a lot of, I don't know, butter or olive oil, they can swap it with some carbohydrates or fruits or something like that. So yeah, the ratios of fats and carbs, I think, matter the least. The most important thing is the calories. Then the second is protein, and the fats and carbs are the third. I do think that the fiber intake is very underrated. For the average person, fiber is super beneficial, and will improve the satiety component of dieting. They'll tend to eat less calories. They'll feel more full. They'll have better gut health, and metabolic health markers also tend to improve with increased fiber intake. So just get a lot of foods from, or get a lot of your, let's say, calories from fruits and vegetables, berries, whole grains, tubers. Those kind of things are generally positive for the average person.
That's great. Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And we're going to get into more specifics on what makes a good or bad protein, good or bad fat, good or bad carbohydrate. So you alluding to some of that with fibers is a great example. So we'll get into that. Greg, how do you think about it?
Very similarly, fundamentally. So I would also begin by trying to find out what the person is trying to accomplish. And typically, some of that is going to relate to weight maintenance or weight gain or weight loss, and then look at their existing food intake using some sort of appropriate measure and try and understand something about their weight trajectory, and then make some changes accordingly. Regarding tracking, I think that it's helpful for almost everyone to track at some point, or at least to spend plenty of time understanding food labels for the reasons that Siim pointed out. But after a certain point, you should get to a stage where you just don't have to do any of that stuff, because you're not going to look back on your life and think, I wish that I'd spent more time on MyFitnessPal. In terms of the rates of gain and loss, it's going to vary quite a lot between people. But if I had to throw out some generic numbers, then I'd suggest that a rate of loss of no more than about 1% of body mass per week is going to work quite well for a lot of people, just because the more rapid the weight loss, the more likely you are to lose fat free mass, which you're trying to hold on to. The exception to that would be someone who has a lot of adipose tissue at the start. So maybe someone who's got class 2 obesity or class 3 obesity, they've got a very high BMI, they can lose weight more rapidly initially with lower risk of losing fat free mass. But also, sometimes if someone's been quite stagnant in their progress for some time, losing weight more rapidly initially can kickstart their motivation. And then suddenly they buy more into some of the lifestyle changes that you're trying to suggest. Regarding how you achieve that change in energy balance, there are different ways that you can go about it. So you could prescribe specific macronutrient targets, but I generally don't necessarily start with that and focus a bit more on diet composition. And like Seem said, I tend to start by looking at someone's protein intake. And I think the optimal protein intake varies quite a lot between people. I won't go into that now, we'll come back to it. But because of protein's effects on appetite control, it can be very helpful in the context of weight loss, not just for the retention of fat free mass. And then fat and carbohydrate, I think you can tinker with. As Seem said, carbohydrate technically isn't essential, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't serve all sorts of very important functions. The one box that you have to check is just making sure that someone is getting enough of the essential fatty acids. Essential meaning that your body can't synthesize them by itself from precursors. So once those are satisfied, you could play around quite a lot with the ratios between fat and carbohydrates, try and come up with something that's appropriate for the person, which might be influenced by some other information that you have about their health status, conditions they're trying to manage, etc. And I find in practice, a lot of the advice that I end up giving people that I work with is surprisingly consistent between people. Like, a lot of people benefit from increasing the protein content of their breakfast, just as one example, and by reducing the number of liquid calories that they consume, whether it's drinking soft drinks or drinking something that masquerades as being a health food. And then in terms of people who are trying to gain weight, I think the optimal rate of gain is probably going to be a bit lower than the optimal rate of loss, just to try and shift the partitioning in favor of gaining relatively more fat free mass and less fat mass. The exception to that might just be someone who's in a state of chronic low energy availability, in which case the game changes quite a lot and you might try and gain at a faster rate, and there might be less guidance about specific food choices and things, because you're actually trying to get the person to be more flexible in general, and maybe to stop labeling items as good or bad and so on if someone has some disordered eating tendencies. So again, very similar to Scene. I think that the sequence that I go through is pretty much identical, actually. How about you, Nick?
Unfortunately, I have to echo everything you guys said again. I guess in a way, it's a good thing because hopefully it doesn't confuse people. That's the way I think about things too. That focusing on nutrition patterns, focusing on calories, typically getting a person, especially if a person has never counted calories before. You said this earlier, Greg, that a person doesn't have to count calories. And I think the vast majority of people probably de- almost definitely don't have to be counting calories. But if you don't have any experience understanding, well, how much you're actually consuming, I think calorie counting and learning how to read a nutrition label can be yeah, invaluable. It can really open your eyes in how you generally think about nutrition. So, for general health, I think that's a good starting point. Maybe do it for 3 days. That's how, like in my nutrition courses, they said 3 days, do 2 days within the week, and then one day on the weekend at the minimum. Maybe you can extend that out to 7 days, because in the grand scheme of things, 7 days out of your entire life being strict about counting calories and just understanding where you are. That's the starting point. Just get a baseline, understand your weight, understand how many calories you're consuming, understanding the macronutrients that you're consuming without trying to make any sort of changes. And once you have that baseline, then from there, you can start to make a lot of these adjustments. You have to think to yourself, okay, well, if I eat a lot of vegetables and a lot of fruits, for some reason I get really bloated all the time. Then you can start to get into, okay, well, what foods am I consuming that's causing a lot of these like gastrointestinal discomfort and whatnot? So you address those issues and you get a bit of a baseline on, okay, what kind of foods can I eat? What kind of foods can't I eat? And then you start getting into, okay, now I'm going to start focusing on trying to up my protein, let's say for breakfast, and just kind of general recommendations like that. And it's pretty remarkable, especially for a person who is overweight, how much of a difference that can make. And if a person really likes calorie counting, maybe that's something that they start adopting. But I think for the vast majority of people, that's definitely not necessary. If you enjoy it, it's something I enjoy doing. So I will be spending the rest of my life in my fitness pal, but for many others, it's not for them, which is definitely understandable. So yeah, calories and just your general nutrition, then focusing on protein, just kind of putting in more protein, especially for breakfast and for lunch. And then fats and carbohydrates, I think they're a lot more interchangeable. Obviously, you have to have a certain amount of fats, but it's not as much as people think. And usually, you get that from consuming a lot of the other foods that you're going to be consuming, unless you're specifically consuming an incredibly dry plant-based diet. In which case, maybe you won't get the right fats that you're supposed to get, which actually segues perfectly into talking about these macronutrients a little bit more specifically. So we talked about protein being pretty important, and we're actually going to be touching on that in more depth in relation to longevity and the different camps of low protein and high protein. I know Greg has quite a few thoughts on that, so tune in for that, folks. I'm very curious on your thoughts on that, but. When we think about these three macronutrients, so we've talked about protein a little bit. Uh, we haven't really discussed fats and we haven't really discussed carbohydrates. But when you frame protein, fats, and carbohydrates, what are, I hate to use the words good and bad forms, but just for simplicity, what are good and bad forms of protein that you aim for and what you try to avoid? And the same thing with fats and carbohydrates. Do you want to start us off, Greg?
Yeah, quite a loaded question. I don't want
Yeah,
to
it is.
label foods as being good or bad, but protein is an interesting one because the reality is that depending on which of the protein quality indices that you look at, animal source proteins tend to be higher quality than plant based ones. And the different protein indices that have been put forward largely relates to two things. One of them is the balance of amino acids in the particular protein, amino acids being the building blocks of those proteins. And another is the digestibility of the protein and therefore how available those amino acids are. And animal sources like eggs and meat and fish and seafood and dairy have well balanced profiles with sufficient quantities of all of the essential amino acids that your body can't knit together. And they also don't have lots of things that could interfere with your ability to take up those amino acids. So things like the amino acids being bound to fibers and so on. So they are certainly good protein sources if we put aside some of the other health related factors that come with amino acids. The issue with plants is that there aren't that many plants that are technically complete proteins by themselves, because they tend to either be short in the amino acid lysine or methionine. And people have spoken about how maybe this explains some of the disposition for cultures in much of the world to put together grains with pulses, like rice and peas or rice and beans, that you see in many traditional dietary patterns, because by combining those foods, you can balance out those profiles. And on a per meal basis, that does make a lot of sense. But I think when it comes to people who are consuming vegan diets and therefore not consuming any of those animal source proteins, actually, what really matters is what goes on over the whole day. We have to think about nutrition over longer timescales. I think we get a bit hung up in terms of the day. So if you're thinking about changing your body weight, for example, the important thing is your energy balance over the week. It's over longer timescales. And with protein, I think the optimal in terms of changes in muscle protein balance would be to have a series of well spaced boluses of proteins. Probably the optimal frequency is probably something like one bolus every 4 hours or so. There's this refractory period immediately post ingestion where you can't keep stimulating your muscle to take up more amino acids. And Phil Atherton and others did a lot of the early work showing that. So it's something like zero point 0.4 grams of a complete protein source per kilogram of body weight every 4 hours or so. Therefore, one could argue that it would be hard to do that consuming isolated plant foods. And therefore, if you are a vegan bodybuilder, you might need to pay a bit more attention to appropriately combining different sources of plant proteins. But for the vast majority of the population, that's not an issue. And daily intake is the thing that matters. And provided that your diet is quite diverse, you don't need to worry about it too much. I do think that people consuming plant based diets might need slightly more protein just because of that difference in protein quality. I don't think it'd be a big difference, and this hasn't been very well studied, but maybe it's something to the tune of zero point 0.1 or zero point 0.2 grams per kilogram per day to reach equivalence with someone that's consuming animal source proteins. But of course, that depends on the distribution and so on. There are rare exceptions where there are a few plant based proteins that do contain complete amino acid profiles. My favorite is the humble potato. Potatoes actually have a great amino acid profile. Corn is also really high in leucine. So, and leucine is this trigger that basically stimulates the potential to build more muscle tissue. You can think of it as being a bit like a construction site of your skeletal muscles, where leucine is like bringing someone in to then order people to put bricks in the wall. And without leucine, you can't initiate that. And one of the reasons why animal source proteins are so good is because of their relatively high leucine content, but there are these exceptional plant foods where they do actually have quite a lot of leucine in them. So that would be something to bear in mind if you're on a vegan diet. But in general, good plant sources of protein include things like various different soy products. And unless you're consuming truly heroic quantities, you don't need to worry about phytoestrogens and stuff. And sources like tempeh and tofu are perfectly good sources. And then otherwise, vegans are probably going to get quite a lot of their protein from things like pulses, so lentils and different beans. And it might be that some people also want to include a protein supplement if they're vegan and they're health concerned. I think they can be helpful, probably more so than the omnivores among us. Not essential necessarily, but if you're struggling to meet your protein targets, then they can be a helpful addition. And choosing something that includes multiple different plant-based sources, I think makes good sense. There's also a separate category of protein-rich foods, namely the insects, which is become something some people have been interested in the last few years because they are actually quite protein dense and they don't taste too bad. But obviously, the thought of eating insects is enough to make some people squirm. And then in terms of good sources of fat, I think fat often comes along for the ride, and you don't need to worry too much about specific sources, with the exception of trying to manage specific blood lipid phenotypes. So if your triglycerides were really high, for example, or your LDL cholesterol was very high. And I think in general, favoring leaner cuts of meat is a smart idea for a lot of people because the saturated fat in the meat does tend to drive up LDL and in turn cardiovascular risk a little bit. And when choosing fish, I think having some oily fish each week, if you eat fish happily and you enjoy it, the best fish sources, in my opinion, are probably the smash fish, which some people might have come across. So sardines, mackerel, anchovies, and salmon and herring, because they're not that high up the food chain that they've bioaccumulated lots of toxins like mercury, but they're also very rich in preformed EPA and DHA, which your body is not very good at making from other fatty acids, including alpha linolenic acid, which is technically essential, but it's really the EPA and DHA that are particularly important. And then in terms of dairy, I think it depends on the person. I think a lot of people consuming full fat dairy is fine. But again, if you were trying to manage very high cholesterol levels, then choosing lower fat dairy sources is probably a good way to go. Occasionally including some eggs too is, I think, very beneficial in large part because they're so nutrient dense and because of their choline content. And obviously, I'm speaking about foods here that really overlap between the protein and fat categories. But in terms of specific added fats, I think including some nuts and seeds is almost always a very good idea. And I'm a fan of avocados and olives. For the most part, across whatever we're speaking about, I tend to favor whole food sources as opposed to oils or supplements when possible. But obviously, oils are very practical and they can be much cheaper for some people to access. So they certainly have their place. And then in terms of carbohydrate sources, I think the paleo people who used to be very anti grains in general were probably a bit misguided with that. And there's definitely a place for whole grains. I think all of the nutritional epidemiology shows that. I'm a particularly big fan of oats. The beta glucan fiber in them has some very interesting properties. But other whole grains, they're fine too. And then other pulses, they're great. Fruits and vegetables and fungi, they can all contribute as well. So just focusing primarily on minimally processed whole food sources. And the processing does matter. So if, for example, you were trying to manage your blood sugar better because you've just been told that you have prediabetes and you could be on the path to type 2 diabetes, then in general, the more heavily processed the carbohydrate, the higher the blood sugar spikes it's going to produce. A good example of this would be something like rice. So if you remove the outside of the rice, then it's going to spike your blood sugar more consuming white rice versus brown rice. But also, if you think about other carbohydrate sources like dried fruit versus whole fruit, the whole fruit is going to be preferable, not just for its effects on blood sugar, but also appetite control. So across those different categories, minimal processing tends to be a good thing, but there's plenty of flexibility within that. I'm sorry for the long answer, but yeah, those are my high level thoughts. They might not seem that high level, but they're pretty high level.
No, that was great. Siim, how do you think about protein, fats, and carbohydrates? Are there particular protein sources or fats or carbohydrate sources that jump out at you as being especially generally beneficial?
Yeah, I think I would apply the same hierarchy to protein, at least, that the most important thing is how much protein you eat. Because if you eat very high quality protein, but not enough in enough quantities, then that's suboptimal than consuming an inferior type of protein in sufficient quantities or above the sufficient quantities. And yeah, like there are proteins that have more amino acids, higher digestibility, higher quality, so to say. But I guess many people get too caught up with that higher quality. Therefore, that's the only thing I need to consume, because based on that logic, we should all be just taking protein powder, because protein powder has much higher digestibility and much more amino acids than any other whole food, higher than steak and eggs, etc. So the quantity of protein is the most important thing. As I said, 1.6 grams per kilogram appears to be, it's generally considered like a maximal optimal intake. You can go above that, but it's not inherently necessary. If you are consuming lower quality of proteins that have fewer amino acids, like more plant proteins, then you probably need more protein in total to make up for the lower quality. So it's not that plants don't have amino acids; they have all the amino acids. Not all of the plant foods have all the amino acids, right? But people eat a mixed diet anyway, so they're gonna get all the amino acids they need. It's just the quantity might be lower in plant foods, but if you eat a sufficient amount of those foods, then you're going to meet the required amino acids or the quantities that you need. On a plant-based diet, you might need more. I like to think that, okay, if you're eating a plant-based diet, then you'll need something like 20-30% more protein to have the same effect as if you were to eat 100% animal-based protein intake. And interestingly, yeah, if you were on a animal-based diet, then you actually need less protein than someone who is on a vegan diet because of the difference in quality. The higher the quality, the lower the protein demand, and the lower the quality of the protein, the more protein you need. And yeah, you can get those foods on a plant-based diet, or get the quantities on a plant-based diet as well. What I like to think with protein is that, yeah, where it's packaged in is also quite relevant, because you can get protein from chicken nuggets or hot dogs or something like that. But generally speaking, those foods tend to be more health harming, especially in large quantities. So they come with trans fats, other preservatives, other ingredients. It doesn't mean that you can't have them in very small amounts, but generally speaking, you want to get your proteins from more whole food sources, such as meat, eggs, fish, beans, legumes. And personally, I think protein powders, although they're processed, I think they're healthy, because they don't just have garbage ingredients. Of course, some protein powders have a lot of added sugars and, yeah, bad ingredients, but generally speaking, protein powders are something that can be a part of a healthy diet. You had one scoop of protein powder per day, then that is generally health promoting. If all of your protein comes from protein powder, then you're probably not going to meet some micronutrients that you would get from the actual whole food protein. But very ultra processed proteins, hot dogs, chicken nuggets, those kind of things, you would want to avoid them. From the health perspective, it's quite interesting. That historically, it's always seen that animal protein intake is associated with increased mortality, increased heart disease, etc., and plant proteins are associated with lower mortality. I do think that it's better to lean more towards like plant proteins from a, let's say, purely longevity health perspective, but 100% plant protein intake probably isn't optimal either, just because in the real world, people aren't able to make up for the lack of quality or the lack of some other nutrients that you can't get from plant foods. Now, if you were to be super meticulous about it, maybe you can pull it off. But let's say the average person probably doesn't have the skills or the knowledge to do so. So theoretically, it's possible probably, but the average person isn't able to pull it off. And there might be like some element with, from a longevity perspective, I like to think that the amino acid balance might have some effect on longevity. So specifically the glycine and methionine ratios. muscle meat is very high in methionine and much lower in glycine. And in animal studies, methionine excess is associated with shorter lifespan, and methionine restriction extends lifespan. So if you eat more plant proteins, you're getting less methionine. So that might have some explanation. That might explain partly why plant proteins are also associated with reduced mortality. But it's not only like the methionine that matters; it's the glycine as well. So it's not the excessive amount of methionine; it's more so the lack of glycine to counterbalance that methionine. The more methionine you eat, the more glycine you also need to balance the homocysteine and something else that might affect the lifespan pathways. So if you eat more glycine, then maybe you can get away with a very high methionine diet, which in animal studies, they have seen that glycine supplementation, even in the presence of high methionine intake, can extend lifespan, or it doesn't shorten lifespan. So maybe if you just supplement a lot of glycine or supplement a lot of collagen or something like that, maybe it wouldn't have an effect on longevity. But I do think that very high methionine intake is, at least based on animal models, is driving aging or shortens lifespan, maximum lifespan at least. And plant proteins are just much lower in methionine. You would still need to supplement some glycine on a plant-based diet because you're not getting that much glycine from plant foods either. But at least you're not getting excessive amounts of methionine. So I like a mixed protein intake: some beans, some meat, some fish, some eggs, and minimize the ultra processed proteins like processed meats, ham, sausages, chicken nuggets, and those kind of things. With fats, the worst fats out there are trans fats. I think pretty much everyone agrees about that. For fats, I think the most important thing is the quantities. Again, how much fat are you eating? Are you gaining weight from that excess fat intake? And how it affects your lipids and blood work. Because people respond very differently to dietary cholesterol and dietary saturated fat. Some people have very high cholesterol and ApoB levels from even small amounts of saturated fat, whereas others don't. So it's very individual based. So the epidemiological studies which suggest that a higher saturated fat intake might increase the risk of heart disease, but what's the causal link there? It's the ApoB, and if your ApoB is low while eating a lot of saturated fat, I don't think that it necessarily will result in heart disease. So the tracking the blood work for fat intake, I think, is very crucial because people respond very differently to different fats due to genetics. But I do think that getting most of your fats from whole foods is smarter rather than adding a ton of butter or even a ton of olive oil. So olive oil is, I would consider, a healthy oil, but I wouldn't add like something 5 tablespoons or 10 tablespoons a day of olive oil to your diet. You generally want to get your fats from the whole foods: meats, fish, eggs, nuts and seeds, avocado, olives, like the whole olives are better as well. And I wouldn't really, add a lot of other types of added fats to your diet, mostly because of the calorie intake. Most people don't need a ton of extra calories. So it's just easier to reduce their calorie intake by cutting out on a ton of extra fats. And carbohydrates, the more processed the carbohydrate, then the worse quality it tends to be. So simple sugars, liquid sugars, refined grains, so more pastries and those kind of things are the worst typically. And vegetables, fruits, berries. I also agree that whole grains are pretty good. Buckwheat, quinoa, sorghum, oats, etc. They're a bit over vilified, I think, in the nutrition space. So oats, they contain a lot of different nutrients, and some of those anti-nutrients, like phytic acid, actually have anti-cancer properties. So I don't think they're that bad from that scenario. Of course, someone has some food sensitivities towards oats or tomatoes even, or whatever the food may be. Yes, for that particular individual, this food isn't suitable. But I don't have any food sensitivities. I can eat tomatoes, I can eat cucumber, I can eat grains, etc. So why should I restrict it? Because it doesn't have any negative effect on my health, and there's no, I guess, physiological reason to do so either. Especially if you look at the research about different these polyphenols and carotenoids on health. Lycopene in tomatoes, it's appears to be associated with reduced prostate cancer risk, and these phytic acid in oats also appear to reduce the risk of cancer. So they all the evidence would point that for, like, generally speaking, they're health promoting, but for specific individuals with food sensitivities or allergies, they tend to cause more harm. So it's always depends on the individual what they should eat at the end of the day.
Yeah, that was great. I think your point about consuming the food forms of fat is especially important, just because we think of fats like olive oil and whatnot, which are generally healthy or at the very least neutral. But if you are consuming large amounts of them, of course, it's going to have negative effect on your health. If you're over consuming in the context of over consuming in your entire diet. Yeah, it's those are definitely good guiding principles. I think some of the takeaways. I think that one aspect which we're about to get into more on protein is that we've been centered a lot more. Seem you mentioned more on the longevity aspect, but it seems like a lot of the conversation around protein seems to be centered around muscle mass and function and whatnot. And I think that uh, there are different ways of thinking about protein. So I think going into protein consumption, again, I guess it goes back to that conversation of, do you want to be in the top 1% of longevity? Do you want to be in really good at athletics, or do you want to be general well-being? Typically, a higher protein intake will lead to benefits. Um, However, if we can steer this conversation towards that top 1% in longevity, there has been quite a debate, we'll say, on the protein front, which seem you alluded to it, talking about methionine, talking about glycine, and the relationship there, and why methionine may be tracking with lower longevity. So, to set this up, there are some longevity researchers that claim that a lower protein diet is better. And then there are protein researchers that claim that a higher protein diet is better. So, I'm going to throw this to Greg first, just because in our last podcast, you had alluded to the fact that you had quite some thoughts on this. So I'd be especially interested. And then I'd love to hear from Siim as well. How do you think about that? How do you tease out the differences in the recommendations, or how researchers are talking about protein?
I think quite a lot of it relates to the types of studies that people are doing. So whether they're doing mechanistic studies to try and understand specific molecular pathways, typically in non-human animals or in cells, versus people who are looking at epidemiology, versus people who understand those things but are doing experimental interventions with people to try and understand protein metabolism. And it seems that if you split people according to which of those camps they're in, you could probably predict what their thoughts are in relation to what the best protein intake for longevity is. Protein is really important, and I favor higher protein intakes for a few reasons, which I glossed over previously. One of those, obviously, is its effects on fat free mass, on skeletal muscle, but also on bone tissue too. Frailty is really important as people get older, because if someone falls, maybe because they don't have sufficient explosive strength in their knee extensors and their hip extensors and their plantar flexors, and then because they've got brittle bones, maybe they've got osteopenia or osteoporosis, they end up breaking a bone, which would often be the hip, then they might end up in a hospital bed being inactive, and then the disuse, not just of their musculoskeletal system, but all of their bodily systems, will precipitate quite a rapid decline. So they end up in this vicious cycle of frailty, and life expectancy after a hip fracture, once you're past a certain age, is not very long at all. So you need to avoid that. And therefore, by providing building blocks to remodel skeletal muscle, but also protein contributes to bone metabolism. Protein is important. Obviously, you need to stimulate that remodeling. And the way you do that is through appropriate resistance training. So it's important in that context, and protein quality feeds into that, as does protein quantity. But it's also instrumental to appetite control. So looking across the different macronutrients, per gram, protein tends to be the most satiating, more so than carbohydrate or fat. We'll put alcohol to the side. It's a slightly confusing one. And therefore, if we think about the fact that we live in an obesogenic environment where people are disposed to overeating, we've spoken so much about energy intake today. If by increasing your protein intake, you end up consuming fewer calories than you otherwise would have, that probably is a good thing if you think about the population at large. So those effects on appetite control matter too. And then protein also stimulates the production of some hormones that ultimately help to reduce blood sugar spikes in response to meals. And it slows gastric emptying too. So the different constituents in your digestive system pass more slowly through the tract, and therefore glucose is going to appear in your blood at a lower rate. So it's also helpful for metabolic control, certainly glycemic control, probably lipemic control too. So in those ways, protein matters. There's also the fact that many protein rich foods are very nutrient dense in general, but they're not necessarily the foods that a lot of people end up consuming. The most nutrient dense animal source proteins include things like offal, so liver and heart, and most people are not particularly interested in consuming those on a regular basis. But for that reason, dietary variety matters, and eating nose to tail has some advantages, which relate in part to what Siim was saying about the different amino acids that you find in those different tissues, but also various different micronutrients. People speak about liver as being nature's multivitamin. So the protein source is really important to general nutrition, much the same way that people encourage people to consume a rainbow of different plant colors, which is good dietary advice. But we want dietary variety across everything that we're consuming. And part of the issue with the epidemiology is that if there's a signal between higher protein intakes and some sort of adverse health outcome, then it can be a red herring. It's due to residual confounding, because the question is, what is driving the higher protein intake? And sometimes additional protein is coming from heavily processed foods that are rich in saturated fat and flour and various other additives that might not be good for you. And so I have a reservation whenever I see studies about red meat intake, for example, because there's a massive difference between consuming 150 grams of beef liver and consuming 150 grams of a very fatty, very processed beef sausage. They're not equivalent. And we need to be able to lump things together to make life easier. But we have to bear in mind some of those nuances when looking at that type of epidemiology. So protein source in that way is really important. And then in terms of the mechanisms, I think what's missed here, because people will tend to focus on the mTOR pathway. We've got this biochemical pathway that's really important to anabolic processes in cells, building new structures. And that is, of course, key to healthy growth and development, but it can go awry during aging. But we have to think about it in the context of specific tissues, and also in terms of turning it on and off. And so there's this assumption that if increased signaling through mTOR seems to largely be pro-aging in model organisms like mice and flies and so on, then we want to reduce protein because protein stimulates activity in the mTOR complex 1 pathway. But there are a couple of big issues with that. One is that we need to carry on that type of signaling in skeletal muscle, especially as we get older, because there can be anabolic resistance in that muscle. So the muscles are less able to knit together new proteins in response to dietary protein, which is largely driven by inactivity rather than anything about aging per se. So because of that, older people benefit from higher protein intakes than the younger counterparts, everything else counted for. And what makes it extra hard is that a lot of older people really struggle to have an adequate appetite. And because protein is very satiating, they therefore, if anything, sometimes end up consuming less protein when they need more. So that complicates things a bit. But just thinking about the whole swathe of adults out there, if protein is satiating, then when people consume higher protein diets, they're going to eat less in total. Less in total means lower energy availability, which in my mind, if calories are a big driver of signaling through those growth promoting pathways, not just mTOR, but insulin, IGF-1 and others, then that reduction in energy balance is going to reduce some of that signaling. And if we're doing activity and we're consuming plenty of protein, then we're still driving that activity in skeletal muscle and bone where we need it. So it doesn't make any sense. And what's happened is you've had scientists like Volta Longo and others, and he published a frankly laughable paper in one of the Cell Press journals about a decade ago, where he did this interesting, really nuanced technical work on mice, if I recall correctly, looking at some effects of protein on pathways that are implicated in chronic disease. And then he tried to back that up with a bizarre analysis of a cohort and massage the data such that it suggested that higher protein intakes were associated with an increased risk of this specific disease that he was looking at. And then in response to that, the protein metabolism researchers who really know their stuff, so people like Stu Phillips, wrote a rebuttal pointing out all the issues with it. But that type of rift between those different camps has continued over the years. So to summarize, I think a lot of people benefit from higher protein intakes. I think where the protein is coming from is really important. I think consuming a diversity of different proteins is a good way to go. And I think a lot of the low protein advocates aren't thinking about what determines longevity in people as opposed to in rats. One of the other things I didn't mention is that protein is important for immune function. If you've got mice that are raised in specific pathogen-free cages where they're not exposed to novel pathogens, and therefore immune function is not a particularly big determinant of their longevity. And these are small animals, they don't have far to fall. If a mice rolls over onto its side or topples over, it's probably not going to break its hip. And their food is controlled, so we can do away with that particular variable. Whereas in humans, if you consume more protein, you're eating less. And you compare that to the human condition, where we're bombarded with novel pathogens all the time, which influence risk of lots of different things, not just the specific infectious disease that's associated with the exposure. So like COVID and SARS. COVID also seems to dispose people to Alzheimer's and various other issues too. And then when we fall really hard. So you put that together and the research doesn't translate. So much preclinical research doesn't translate. And I think protein is a really good case in point. So I feel like I've been sat happily on my soapbox for a while. And I don't mean to disparage Longo and pick him out as the worst purveyor of this, because he's done some really good research and he does these amazingly intricate experiments that are really impressive and really interesting mechanistically. But it just exemplifies a limitation of that type of research that frustrates me. And I'm happy that some people who really, really know their protein well are now given large platforms. As is often the case with podcasts, people tend to just come back to the same three people. So if you listen to protein researchers, then it's often Luke Van Loon or Stu McGill or Jorn Trommelen or someone like that. And there are loads of great protein scientists that are out there. Like I mentioned Phil Atherton earlier, like him and Mike Rennie at the University of Nottingham, they've done amazing research over the years. Like, I could list many more people. And some of those people, they never get any limelight, but they really, really know their stuff. These other people, they know their stuff about other things, but they're coming at this tangentially, which is helpful in terms of ideation, but it sometimes means that they completely miss the big picture.
That's, yeah, it's incredible. I I think, probably some of my follow-up questions would probably be better off podcast simply because, they're gonna get a lot they're gonna get very technical, but I'd be really interested in your take on some of these, Longo studies because I've just started delving into them, and especially considering your knowledge about some of the other researchers, some of the other protein metabolism researchers have put out there, I'd really like to pick your brain on some of that, but I'll leave that for another time simply because, again, it's just gonna get too technical, and I think, I can see the YouTube comments already. Some people will be like, "Oh, that was amazing," and then the vast majority will be like, "How do I use this?" So so I'll leave it, but that was absolutely fascinating to listen to, so I really appreciate it. The one question I have before we go to Siim's perspective on this is when it comes to epidemiological research, because you're mentioning residual confounding, and again, I don't want to get too technical with this, but don't you think that, especially considering we've got so many studies in different cohorts, or at least my understanding is that we've got different cohorts on this stuff that, and different research groups that have probed this question, don't you think that a lot of that stuff, some of the obvious ones have been accounted for, like saturated fat or heme or some of these other factors that would track with protein intake? And we still, as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I haven't done a deep dive into this yet. We still see these links between increased mortality with really high protein intakes compared to lower protein intakes. What's your take on that?
Well, I haven't spent that much time looking at that body of research for a while, if I'm being frank, because I tend to focus on certain types of research. And there are some of these questions that just get cycled over again and again and again over the years. Something comes into favor and then it goes back out of favor and then it comes back again. So, like one of the things that you mentioned is the whole seed oil debate at the moment, which is something that was widely discussed about 15 years ago when the paleo diet was at its most popular.
Hmm.
And so, honestly, I think that my thoughts about that are relatively established, and I now have the knowledge that I need to have to be able to move on. And it just doesn't feel like the best use of my attention resources. So, I can't comment too much about specific studies. If that is the case and there is that type of consistency between studies, then that's interesting. But I think nutritional epidemiology in general, and I don't mean to seem like I'm now cherry picking, but just as a broad comment about nutritional epidemiology, in many instances, it's incredibly noisy. And obviously, John Ioannidis and others have written about this over the years. And there are some people who basically say that we should just throw it all under the bus. And I wouldn't go that far because I think that if you take the example of biomarkers of dietary intakes, there are some biomarkers that correspond very well to how people are actually eating. And the dietary assessment methods that we use are also getting better over time. We're not just relying on food frequency questionnaires, which have some advantages, or 24-hour dietary recalls using traditional interviewer style administration. But there are certainly limitations to that. And I think also there's, so going back to those camps, I think there are people who want to see certain results and therefore will go about their data analyses in certain ways. You can start to work out if that's the case by looking at various different things, but it's always interesting to see someone who, ahead of publishing the original research, has published some sort of protocol. Like there's the journal Trials, where people publish what they're going to do and then they stick to it, which is great because it keeps them honest, that it stops them from p-hacking and trying to look through the data in different ways, try and tease out associations, which then facilitates publication because it's hard to publish negative results, by which I mean null results. So finding there was no relationship between two things. So I think some of it probably does relate to that. But otherwise, foods are really complicated. They interact with each other. the food matrices and so on matter too. And so I think looking to some of the intervention trials can tell us quite a lot when we do that with dietary protein. And admittedly, a lot of those trials are on protein powders and things. But like, take the example of whey protein supplementation. It's been meta-analyzed for its effects on all sorts of things, including changes in fat-free mass and change in blood lipids and so on. And across the board, it looks good. So I think a lot of it, if there is a relationship there, it's driven by what I was saying about the sources of protein being foods that aren't particularly healthy. What we would have called junk foods previously, which nowadays would be given the euphemistic label ultra processed foods. So there's probably a slightly inadequate answer, but I think that stuff does contribute.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, we could definitely go on discussing a lot of the research on that. I do want to get into a lot more depth on that in general. But Siim, what are your what's your perspective on the longevity versus kind of how the I mean, even Greg just now mentioned it, right? Some of the protein research that shows direct intervention trials saying, hey, you consume protein, you get better fat-free mass, you get reduced body weight, body fat. You tend to see improved serum lipids and whatnot. So how do you reconcile that, or don't you?
Mm. Yeah, well, with all research, it's important to, first of all, not look at a single study, and also not look at just one line of evidence. So if you just look at observational studies, then you can draw certain conclusions about protein intake and longevity. And generally, it's going to be that higher protein diets are associated with reduced mortality, maybe with the exception of elderly people, where you tend to see the flip of that, that lower protein diets are actually associated with higher mortality in elderly people because of the reasons that Greg said about hip fractures and those things. And if you look at just animal research, then yeah, you can also see that high protein diets are worse and low protein diets are better. But that's, these animals live in cages and they're not in the free world where they can break a hip, etc. So there's a lot of things you need to consider when you're just looking at one line of evidence, and you need to look at multiple lines of evidence. There's the mechanistic studies about mTOR and methionine and those things. There's animal studies. There's observational studies. There's randomized controlled trials as well that obviously can't look at longevity, but they can look at certain aspects of health like fat mass and the blood sugar and those things. So there's obviously no perfect answer to anything in nutrition and exercise as well when it comes to long-term health outcomes and longevity. But there's a certain trends you can look at, and if multiple lines of evidence point in a certain direction, then you can at least you know I guess lean towards a certain opinion. You can't make some definite conclusions, but you can lean towards some certain uh, trends a little bit. So what my opinion is about protein and longevity is that I think people should eat enough protein, and there's no need to eat more protein because it potentially could be harmful, especially when we're talking about maximal lifespan. So I don't think anyone needs to eat more than 1 gram per pound of body weight of protein per day. Some bodybuilders, they eat 1.5 grams per pound, 2 grams per pound, or something like that. I think it's completely unnecessary, first of all, for muscle growth or body composition purposes, and potentially could be harmful. I don't think it necessarily is in the short term, especially, but over the course of decades, we don't know what would be if someone eats 300 grams of protein every day for 50 years. um, so what would be enough protein? I think this 1.6 grams per kilogram is more than enough because it maximizes muscle growth, body composition outcomes, and you still even build muscle with a lower protein intake than that. Something like 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, I think, is the sweet spot for protein for a muscle growth perspective, muscle growth purposes. And you need certain amount of muscle for longevity, because if you're sarcopenic and low muscle and low bone density, then yeah, your risk of breaking a hip, falling off the stairs or something like that is much higher in elderly years. Now, older people, I think, do need slightly more, perhaps maybe 20 20% more or something like that. But here, I think the meal frequency appears to be more important because, like Greg said earlier, there's this refractionary period or a certain maximal threshold that you can stimulate protein synthesis with each meal for a certain period of time. So even if we eat 300 grams of protein in one meal, it's not the same as dividing it into 4 meals across the entire day. So if someone needs to maintain more muscle to avoid sarcopenia, they probably need to spread it out more. So elderly person, they shouldn't do 1 meal a day. They should have, I think, 4 protein meals per day of at least 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal, depending on their body weight. Uh, but for a younger person, they can eat much larger amounts of protein and in less meals. So the Jon Trommerland's research 2 years ago now show that your body can absorb 100 grams of protein in one meal, and it actually maintained a higher anabolic state for a longer period of time as well compared to 25 grams of protein. So you don't necessarily need to micromanage the frequency if you're a younger person, but if you're older, then you do need to ensure at least 3-4 protein meals per day. Now, low protein diets for a younger individual probably are safe in the short term because younger individuals tend to have higher amounts of muscle mass than elderly people. And especially if you're doing resistance training, even on a low protein diet, you can still, I guess, maintain some of that the muscle mass as well much more easily. But I do think the elderly person needs more protein. So let's say 1.7, 1.8 grams per kilogram, maybe 2 grams per kilogram. But no one needs 300 grams of protein per day. So I do think that first of all, it's unnecessary to be eating a ton of protein, and secondly, if you want to do some sort of let's say precautionary principle, then you want to lean towards a moderate amount of protein. I don't think a very high protein diet is inherently harmful, but why take the risk if it's not physiologically required? Uh, even for muscle growth. So the protein intake for muscle growth is higher than you need for muscle maintenance. You can maintain muscle on a pretty low protein diet. For elderly people, it's not optimal, but for younger individuals, it is manageable. If someone has low bone density already in their youth, or if they do a DEXA scan in their 40s, they see that they have low bone density, low muscle mass. It's going to be harder to build it later in life. So you need to catch up. You need to maybe increase your protein intake a lot and make sure you lift weights, etc., to increase your bone density and muscle mass so that you wouldn't be frail when you're 80 years old. But I guess, yeah, there's a lot of talk about the importance of protein, but I also think that a lot of it is overhyped, that you don't need insane amounts of protein. I think the 1 gram per pound is already more than enough. You don't need that much. The research shows that 1.6 grams per kilogram already maximizes, generally speaking, the muscle hypertrophy. And if you eat less than that, then that's actually also enough to maintain at least muscle and build it slightly. You're not completely optimizing muscle hypertrophy with a 1.2 gram per kilogram protein intake, but you can easily do it. Interestingly, I did in my own experiment. A few years ago, I was eating 1 gram per pound, which is 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein. I've reduced it to 1.6, so I dropped my protein intake by about 25%. I didn't lose muscle. Based on my DEXA scan, I actually increased my appendicular lean mass index by something like 200 grams within the span of from my first DEXA scan in 2023 and the last one this January. So like within the span of 1.5 years, I actually gained 200 grams of lean tissue in my arms and legs by reducing my protein intake by 25%. Now it's still a high protein intake compared to the standards. The standard diet, 1.6 grams per kilogram, is much higher than the average person eats, but it's lower than what a lot of, I guess, bodybuilders or protein researchers recommend, the 1 gram per pound of body weight.
I'm assuming that with that experiment, you were continuing to make progress in the gym too.
Yeah, so I increased my volume in the gym. So I did more. I reduced the weight because I was in a actually slightly calorie deficit, but I increased the volume. So I was doing slightly lower weights, maybe 5-10% lower weights, but I was doing 4 more reps per set. So my total volume increased. So the biggest contributor is obviously resistance training. If you eat 300 grams of protein per day, but you're not lifting weights, then your lean muscle mass would be probably higher than someone who eats low protein and doesn't lift weights, but it's not going to be higher than someone who eats low protein and lifts weights, in my opinion. And looking back at the mechanisms, eating a ton of protein but not lifting weights probably drives cancer more than if you were to be lifting weights. So where do you so the mTOR pathway, you can activate mTOR in different organs. You don't want to activate mTOR, in your liver or certain other tissues, but you want to activate mTOR is in your muscles. You need mTOR in the brain as well for brain cell neurogenesis, but you mostly want to activate mTOR in the muscle cells to help with muscle growth. So the signal for that is resistance training. If you don't lift weights, then you activate mTOR in the wrong places, in my opinion, and that might not be the most optimal.
This conversation, I think, is just it's a single question that could suck up hours and hours of time, simply because, like Siim, you just touched on so many different aspects, so many different contexts, right? If you're lifting weights, if you're not lifting weights, if you're overweight, if you're not overweight, if you're over the age of, let's say, 60, if you're frail, if there's life circumstances, if you're dealing with cancer, if you're dealing with other disease states like diabetes, there's so many different circumstances that we have to take into account. And I do think my perspective is that the protein requirements and the protein recommendations are going to shift based off of, and shift pretty wildly, actually, based off of individual circumstance that I don't necessarily think I would say with some of the other macronutrients. Like, for example, carbohydrates, I think for the most, like if I were to focus on fiber, let's say, I think by and large, and correct me if I'm wrong, we'd probably say generally more fiber is better. I mean, up to a point. Obviously, you're gonna start feeling pretty uncomfortable once you get to 100 grams of fiber or whatever it might be. But um, the so if you have cancer, if you're older, if you're all these things, the general take is okay, increase your fiber no matter what, and then you can start playing around with some of these other factors. But for protein, I'm not I'm really not convinced that, just aiming for higher protein is always better. I think I'm still at the infancy of trying to really reconcile that, because all the protein research that I've looked at has been in relation to exercise performance, body weight, body fat, all that stuff, and in those contexts, yeah, a higher protein diet tends to be beneficial. Um, but as you get into the longevity space, I'm still at the infancy of trying to understand that, but it seems to me like there may be some contradictory information or data out there, which, to Greg's point about some of Longo's, Dr. Valto Longo, who's a, for anybody who's not aware, is a researcher that's done a lot of work on longevity, basically, and has delved into a little bit on this protein front, and seems to believe that lower protein and pretty sizably lower protein diet is more beneficial for longevity. Um, I still need to look into that research a lot more, but there is more and more research from my perspective. I don't know if you guys saw a recent study that came out maybe 3 weeks ago, a month ago, looking at low protein diets and the effect that it had on longevity in mice. And then there's another study that's been done in humans that parallels a lot of the same results. So, increases in metabolism, reductions in body fat, increases in lean mass, like things like that, were paralleled between the human cohort as well as the mouse study. And while I certainly wouldn't jump to any conclusions based off of that research, I think that there may be something there that we still need to investigate. But the overall point being that, there's just so much context that needs to be applied to a person's individual circumstance, and I think for the average person, I think a higher protein diet tends to be, beneficial across the board.
Yeah. So I think it's, yeah, important to, I guess, define as well what is high protein and low protein. For for the government organizations, a high protein diet is, I think, already something that is above 17% of total calories. So that's, we would consider it low protein still. I think a high protein diet is, yeah, anything above 1.6 grams per kilogram and up to 2.2 grams per kilogram, like what the bodybuilders eat. I think that's a high protein diet. But compared to what the average person eats, I'm also eating a high protein diet, although I'm eating 130 grams of protein, 120, 130 grams of protein per day. Compared to the bodybuilders, I'm eating a, maybe moderate protein diet, but compared to the general population, I'm eating a high protein diet. So yes, the general population generally needs to increase their protein. That maybe they might eat, let's say, I'm just throwing out numbers, but I would imagine the average person eats something like 1 gram per kilogram at the most. So they would probably need to increase the protein by 30 to 50% for, and they would see health improvements because they'll eat also other things less. They'll eat less junk and less calories overall. But yeah, someone who's health conscious, they're probably eating already enough protein that they don't need to necessarily add a ton of extra.
Nick, I don't want to dwell on this one too much longer, but I just want to throw in a few other thoughts just to tick some
Sure.
boxes that I haven't ticked.
Yeah.
One of them is that the irony of all this stuff is that protein tends to come along for the ride with energy intake in total. And so a lot of the people who are most fussed about their protein intakes don't have to care about it because they're consuming lots of calories anyway. And that's typically true of the gym rats because the more total calories you consume, the more your protein is going to climb. So many people who need to worry about this stuff are the people who don't think twice about it. And the people who worry most about it, they shouldn't care less. And then obviously energy availability interacts with your protein needs. So Siim spoke about how he was building muscle on a lower protein diet. If everything else had been held constant, then I would expect the reduction in protein intake to slightly negatively affect his muscle protein balance. But if total energy intake is going up, then protein matters a little bit less. More of it can be partitioned towards skeletal muscle as opposed to being used for other processes.
I was still in a calorie deficit. I was losing the body fat as well. My visceral fat and stuff went down.
Yeah.
My so
But the general point remains. And then in terms of factors that modify your protein needs, so energy availability is one of those, as I was just saying. Another is age because of that anabolic resistance that I mentioned earlier. So in general, older people would probably benefit from slightly higher intakes, but some of that is just because of physical activity, because people become less physically active, and then protein quality, as we spoke about earlier. So based on all of that, there's a range of intakes that are going to be they're going to be appropriate for people. And from my perspective, the range of intakes that I would recommend to people that don't have any medical conditions that would contraindicate higher protein diets could be anywhere from about 1.2 to about 2.8 grams per kilo. 2.8 grams per kilo would be for a vegan bodybuilder deep into contest prep with low energy availability, doing lots of exercise, who's a little bit older. So everything is stacked in favor of higher protein intakes. Whereas I think for the general population, probably something around 1.4 grams per kilo is going to work really well. And there are other factors to consider too, like planetary boundaries and stuff, which are important for the world at large. So yeah, I just wanted to chime in with those closing thoughts because I realized that I hadn't mentioned anything about protein intakes and what I thought might be an appropriate range for people. So quite a big range, but most people, they do well at the lower end of that range. And reference nutrient intakes tend to be about zero 0.8 grams per kilo. And I think expressing intakes in this instance relative to body mass is much more helpful than speaking about a percentage of calories. It's so much more informative. So with protein, I'd certainly always do that. With carbohydrate, I think for athletes, it's helpful to do that too. But I'll pause there because we've probably spoken about protein for about an hour now.
Yeah, it has been a while. But your guys' ranges that you're mentioning is exactly my point, that it's so context driven. So yeah, we'll leave it there, but there's definitely plenty more to say on the topic. Um, so we don't have too much more time. So I'd like to discuss just one more thing, and then we'll get to kind of the final thoughts and final points. So I'm going to merge two questions into one because they're tightly linked with one another. I don't know, Siim, you probably have a lot more experience with this, but maybe Greg, you do too on social media, that you have this, it's almost like this quasi war between low carb community and the plant-based community. And it seems like both sides are kind of at odds with one another. And certainly there's some crossover as well, but generally there's this kind of back and forth. And my question to you is that how do we reconcile the fact that, and maybe you feel slightly differently about this, but I'll ask it this way anyway. How do you reconcile the fact that low carb diets across a multitude of studies can show improvements in diabetes, so diabetes remission, improvements in seizures, significant fat loss, and other health outcomes end up better, and yet we still see a lot of plant-based diets, at least, and maybe this goes back to some of Greg's critiques in epidemiological research, but also in clinical trials, indicating that plant-based diets tend to come out on top in terms of lifespan and health span. So, first of all, do you guys agree with that? And secondly, if you do, or if you don't, I'd be curious on how you reconcile that. How do you think about that? Siim, do you wanna take a stab at this first?
Yeah. Well, I think in epidemiological studies, it's mostly because I guess you can find a correlation between plant-based foods and the higher diet quality. That the overall diet is higher quality, generally speaking, if you eat a lot of plants. And of course, you can try to confound for these variables, but it's not going to be perfect. So I do think that eating more, getting a lot of calories from plants is probably, more beneficial for most people. And but it doesn't mean that it needs to be like 100% plant-based or something like that. So it's obviously an unanswered question that we don't have an answer to that because there's never been this clinical trial that's done this investigation for long enough of a period of time. But I do generally think that eating more plants and fiber results in better diet quality. And if you have better diet quality, you tend to be in better health and a better body composition over the long term as well. When it comes to the short term trials, then low carb diets are better in weight loss and blood sugar management in the short term. But if you span it out over the course of a year or 2 years, then they tend to equal out. So low carb diets result in much faster weight loss, mostly because of the water weight loss that happens if you have low levels of insulin, so you lose more water. But over the long term, there doesn't appear to be that much of a big difference when it comes to weight loss and blood sugar management. Now, someone should someone follow a low carb diet to improve their blood sugar or help with weight loss? I think depends on the person. I think some people find it more suitable or easier to adhere to, but others might not. So personally, I actually do better on a higher carb diet. Obviously, I don't have diabetes or obesity, but it depends a lot on the person what diet they prefer. But I guess the important aspect is in the metabolic wart studies, where all the foods and calories are controlled for, there's no difference in weight loss, because the people are fed. They're put in this lab, and they're fed everything in the exact same quantities, etc. So high carb intake isn't gonna be an inhibiting factor for weight loss in these controlled studies, which means that in the real world, people who are doing low carb diets, they just feel more satiated, or they end up eating fewer calories. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that calories don't matter, or that carbohydrates are somehow bad, that they prevent you from losing weight. It's just that in the real world, the same with intermittent fasting, in uncontrolled studies, people who do intermittent fasting tend to lose more weight, but in these actually randomized controlled trials, there's no difference between regular calorie restriction and intermittent fasting for weight loss. In the real world, people might find a low carb diet or intermittent fasting easier to adhere to. So that's why they end up eating less due to satiety or something else. And yeah, from these short-term studies, these clinical trials, even 2-year clinical trials, we're not going to be able to say what is going to be the outcome in decades, because things like heart disease, Alzheimer's, they take decades to progress. So even if someone might be losing weight initially within the span of even 2 years, we don't know what is going to be the final outcome in 50 years, 60 years. So that's why uh, you know, there's going to be still a lot of unanswered questions in that area. So I think for most people, the biggest, let's say, short-term goal would be to achieve normal body weight and achieve normal metabolic health, and then try to adopt a more balanced diet over the long term, which would be, I guess, again, from a precautionary principle, smarter to have a slightly more balanced diet.
Yeah, great. Okay. Greg, you want to chime in?
Sure. Yeah, just on what Siim mentioned at the end there, I think people need to bear in mind the more restrictive their diet is in terms of diet composition, the more at risk they are of both nutrient deficiencies and nutrient excesses too. And so variety is good. And unless you're using nutrition to try and therapeutically manage a health condition, I think relatively mixed approach is going to work well for a lot of people. I'll point out a few things. One is that the division between those two different camps is interesting because you can, of course, be on a low carb diet and be on a vegan diet at the same time. And I say vegan because I'm slightly allergic to the term plant based. I know it's so used nowadays, but what was wrong with vegan? Like, what do we mean by plant based? Like, vegan and vegetarian, they have very specific connotations. I guess that it was in part a response to some of the negative connotations that came with those particular labels. But I've always found it slightly vague and pointless as a term. But it's widely used nowadays, so I'll move on from that. But in terms of what you mentioned, Nick, I largely agree. And I think some of that reflects what I was speaking about earlier in discussing protein. And by that, I mean that there is going to be some healthy user bias with some of those studies that's not accounted for in statistical analyses. People who consume more plants, probably more interested in health in general, probably a bit more physically active and so on. Some of that is a little bit difficult to account for in that type of research. And then we've got the sources and so on that contribute to that too. But we need to bear in mind that those studies showing beneficial effects are in the context of trying to manage a health condition, typically, whether it's just someone having too much body fat or being dyslipidemic and using a low carb diet to, say, drive down their triglycerides, whatever it might be. And you can formulate a healthy low carbohydrate diet, which would be perfectly conducive to living a long time. If your fat sources are predominantly coming from plants, so avocados and nuts and seeds and so on, as we mentioned earlier, and your diet isn't heavily processed and you've got good diet variety, diet timing is appropriate, adequate protein, and so on. That's a perfectly healthy dietary pattern. And so I think we have to come back to some of the best experimental studies that have been done to help inform us about what might be an appropriate path. And the study that comes to mind, which I'm sure you guys have both read, is Chris Gardner's old Diet Fit study, where for 12 months, people who were overweight or obese were randomized to either a healthy low carb or a healthy low fat diet. And they're both weight loss diets. And at the end of the 12 months, the weight loss was almost precisely the same in the two groups. And their general health looked very similar too. And they also looked at some single nucleotide polymorphisms to try and work out whether people might be better suited to one type of diet than the other and so on. And there have been some reanalyses since then to try and work out if that is the case. And maybe we'll find out over time that we can make personalized recommendations based on certain biomarkers, identifying who is best suited to that diet and who's best suited to that diet. But the general point is that they can both be healthy. And so a lot of this stuff does come down to personal preferences. We can be a bit more targeted with how we manipulate those variables to nudge things in the right direction. But you just have to bear in mind what is sustainable for someone. What can they stick to? Compliance is really important. And with the epidemiology, I think we always need to take it with a pinch of salt, not too much salt because sodium will push up your blood pressure, but just with a pinch of salt.
I think another aspect. So both, I completely agree with both of you guys. I think one other aspect is that there seems to be this almost contradictory mentality that comes with a lot of this tribalism in certain nutrition camps. It's almost like we've created these identities for both groups when exactly to you guys both talked about it that it can be married. Like you can be a low carb and be to use Greg's favorite term, plant-based. You can do both. So they don't have to be either or, but it seems more that the disagreement comes from, well, I've chosen my side, so therefore I will defend it to all ends, as
And
opposed to actually focusing on some of the scientific literature that shows that both can work.
sorry to interrupt you, Nick. I
No,
just
go
think
for it.
you've got to bear in mind in that instance too that what does sometimes happen is that there's a vested interest. It's not necessarily there at the start the whole time, but maybe someone takes a stance, let's say that it's a low carb stance, and they don't necessarily even plan to make relevant products in the future, but then 2 years later there's an opportunity and they start making some sort of low carb lifestyle product. And then that causes them to dig their heels in more. And going back to Volta Longo, I wonder if that's happened with him a little bit, where he's now got his fasting, mimicking low protein prolon diet, where he sells these very expensive, very low calorie items for people to consume for a few days every once in a few months. And low protein is a big part of that approach. And then that reinforces the stance because now there are other things on the line too. I'm not saying that that's happened with him, but it is a relevant example. So I think it's helpful to sometimes look at the different ties that people have. And I always appreciate it when you find people who superficially you might expect to have certain ties. Maybe the research has been funded by a certain industry, or maybe they've helped produce a particular product, but then they change their stance. They say, well, I was wrong about that stuff. Sodium obviously does increase blood pressure. Potassium does lower blood pressure. That stuff does matter. And it's always entertaining seeing the evolution of some influencers and how they modify things over time. And then suddenly this is permissible in their world, whereas 2 years ago it was absolutely not an option.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a very political, like you can predict someone's political views based on what's their handle. Is it if is it like a carnivore handle or a vegan handle? You can pretty much 90% be accurate what their political leaning is as well.
Do carnivores lean right?
Well, I don't know a lot of left-wing carnivores. So.
I don't know any, but Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's just it's just the issue that it's not only a nutrition debate, it's a political debate as well that people have.
Yeah.
And I guess that in a lot of ways makes it a very more confrontational, and identity is involved here as well. If your handle is, you start your Instagram with whatever handle, like a carnivore this or vegan this or something like that, and you change it, then people are gonna be like, "Well, what the hell?" You create your brand, your business around a handle or a particular diet, and you change it, then it's obviously gonna be harmful for your business, and harmful for your social media status overall. So you dig in much harder if you identify as part of a certain group of dieters or whatever other ideology it is.
I think a great example of that is a person I strongly disagree with on a lot of things, Carnivore MD or Paul Saladino. Um, but something that I
Best
really,
name ever.
yeah, yeah, I know. But that said, um, one thing I do respect about him is that he went, as far as I understand, he was Carnivore MD, and then he semi recently switched to going by his full name, Paul Saladino, which and he also incorporated a lot more fruits into his diet when he was, I think, almost primarily all I think all meat
In the beginning,
consumed
it was all meat. Yeah.
at the beginning, which I mean, to me, in that scenario where his name is Carnivore MD and having to make that shift, I mean, as much as I disagree with him, I have to say that I really respect that shift. So it's difficult, but exactly to your guys' point, it's very difficult to do that, especially when you have a huge following of individuals that it's to a certain degree, in certain instances, it's a pretty unhealthy admiration for the, social media influencer. So to have that conscientiousness to say, "Hey, I need to change my stance on something,"
Mhm.
especially when you've got products attributed to it, is incredibly difficult. So, yeah.
He's selling coffee now, so
Well, hey, I think we're on board with
which
coffee.
yeah, but it was the devil last year,
Oh,
so
was it? Oh, that's
yeah.
right. As a matter of fact, I created a video about that. I completely forgot about that. That is so I did not realize he was selling coffee. I'm assuming there's something special about the coffee,
Is he
like
selling
Well,
coffee?
it's
Or just
mold-free
having it?
or
yeah,
something.
yeah, I
I'm
think
gonna
he's
assume.
recently started to sell that, yeah. But I
Okay,
mean, it's, fine to change your mind, right? You
right.
can obviously do that, then you can explain the reasons for that. But I guess the issue is that if you're so sure that your coffee is bad, and next year you start selling it, or you're so sure that vegetables are bad or whatever, and then you start eating them. So I guess what I like is that if someone is super sure about it, that okay, this is true, this is false, this is the right way to eat, it's just a red flag that they don't
Mm.
actually understand the nuance, and they don't understand the context, and they're just dig in based on their identity and based on just opinion or ignorance, that they're so sure. But in the example of someone like Paul, or there's many other examples you can make. I'm sure there's vegans who turn animal based, and there's you can find examples of this all the time. So if someone is so sure about something, then they probably don't really appreciate the context, because our podcast here, we never came to absolutes. We always on the edge of the context of this very, you know it sounds like we don't, like we're very vague, or that we're not giving clear answers, but that's because there are no clear answers. That it's always context dependent and very nuanced. But if someone it's just more easier to sell if you're super confident, and people tend to gravitate towards confidence because it makes them feel that the person knows what they're talking about.
Meanwhile, you have people that are gonna be listening to this, and they're gonna say, "Well, why can't you guys just give me the answer?" Right? And I understand, like, I understand that mentality. I understand, like, I want to just tell me what I need to do, right? And I can empathize with that, but exactly to Seam's point, I think that's such an astute observation that For a lot of conversations, especially when you talk to researchers, Greg, you know this well, there's there's a lot of like, well, yeah, I mean, maybe we could look at it from that perspective, but I think I would probably add this one quick caveat in this situation, and it's it's like trying to catch water, it just slips right through your fingers because there's so much data that we need to be able to be really confident about things, but to be clear, dear listener, there are things that we are pretty confident about. Like, I don't think any person or most people would not disagree that like exercise is beneficial for health, like things like that. We can make some statements that with mass inputs of data, we've come to the conclusion. I don't think, regardless of how we slice the data, you're almost always going to come out with a conclusion of, yes, this is beneficial or this is harmful. Trans fats is another example. I think we've come to the conclusion that trans fats tend to be detrimental to health.
CLA, Nick.
CLA?
CLA is a trans fat technically. So
Okay.
natural trans fat found in animal foods, not too bad.
Okay.
I'm being a jerk, but I'm actually reinforcing your point, which is that
Yeah,
there are nuances to this stuff, and there are some general principles to hold.
exactly.
I just
Exactly.
enjoy being a pain in the ass.
Yeah, I would expect nothing else. Or being obese typically is not a good thing for your health. Like, things like that we can agree on, and as we keep getting more data, we can start slicing deeper and deeper into those nuances. And when you talk to experts and you tell them, "This is my circumstance. What should I do?" They are able to be like, "Oh, in your circumstance, this is what the data is tending towards." And you can get a lot more specific recommendations. But, going to a podcast and getting, coffee is bad without any context or whatever
Unless it's my
is,
coffee.
yeah, unless it's my coffee, of course, then, that can seem enticing because it's so simple, but it leads to a lot of backtracking if a person is ethical, and in the worst scenario, which is often the case, it just leads to a lot of confusion and dogmatism that comes along with that. So, on that bright note, do you do you guys have any final words to any last bits of wisdom that you'd like to impart?
Go and buy Paul Saladino's coffee. I was just thinking when you're saying that, I find it almost unbelievable that he's selling coffee now. But him being the carnivore MD, I thought, I wonder if it's Kopi Luwak. Do you know Kopi Luwak?
No.
Kopi Luwak is a type of coffee that originated in Indonesia, where they basically feed coffee beans to civets, type of cat, and then they poo out the beans, and then they use the beans for their coffee. And some people claim that it's the best coffee on the planet. It's objectively not, and they sell it for extortionate prices. But I thought him being the carnivore MD, maybe that way he's getting some of the civet microbiota, capitalizing on a fellow animal, and so he's turned it into some sort of animal food. But it sounds like that's probably not the case. It's probably just some washed coffee from Costa Rica. Anyway, it's very entertaining. Gotta love this stuff.
For sure. Yeah, I've never heard of that before. I'm gonna look into it now.
No, don't. It's really unethical too. And I
Uh,
find it so interesting that people get so worked up about this stuff. I mean, we might see it in comments on this video, that people really lay into people online because they're speaking about nutrition and because what they say conflicts with how they view things. And if you're that type of person, just stop doing that, because honestly, you're wasting your time. It doesn't help anyone. And as a general comment, I think a big problem in the world feels like we've shifted to politics. Big problem in the world is that people pay attention to the wrong people, and that puts more eyes on them. So if you've got someone who's clearly spouting complete nonsense, just ignore them. Just stop following them. So yeah, another positive note to end on there. You're welcome.
Seem, do you have any final words? Any parting words?
Yeah, I think many people might overthink the nutrition. I think the human body is very adaptable, and we can thrive on many different types of diets. Inuit living in the north eating a very different diet than the Maasai or people in the Amazonian rainforest, etc. So humans can obviously thrive on many different diets. They can be low carb, they can be high carb, they can be more plant based, more animal based. There's underlying principles that matter more than the actual food that you eat. Now, if you eat certain foods, you're going to be more aligned with those principles, namely eating predominantly whole foods and not in very large quantities, so that you maintain calorie balance. But the principles matter more, rather than there's some specific food out there that is the best food or a miraculous food. Certain foods are better than others. You don't need to always eat the best food. It's like, if you have a Ferrari, you don't need to take the Ferrari to a supermarket every day. You can take your Toyota to the supermarket every once in a while. So it's just, yeah, like the overall lifestyle matters a lot, and the nutrition is obviously a big part of that lifestyle. And you don't need to get caught up with a specific diet, especially if that is influenced by politics or identity politics or something like that. Because then it's not actually rooted in nutrition; it's rooted in the politics. If you're eating in a certain way influenced by politics, um, yeah, I guess eat a balanced diet is quite important. Or the easiest takeaways to eat different types of foods, not too much, and adjust your lifestyle based on adjust the nutrition, I guess, based on the signal your body's giving you, the blood work, the gastrointestinal symptoms, the sleep problems, or exercise performance, etc., and adjust the nutrition based on the goals and what your body is telling you.
Yeah,
Can I
I
ask
think
a
so.
question to finish with?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's the question that everyone's been dying to hear the answer to, and that is, Nick, tell us about your diet.
And on that, folks, we're going to end this podcast. uh, um, yeah, I'm not going to answer that, but you'd be shocked how many comments I get. Just all people assuming what I eat, and then they'll exactly to your guys' point.
I bet you're a
Seam's point.
raging carnivore.
Oh, yes. I'm coming out with my own coffee soon, fed to cats. Okay, so we could definitely end it on that.